Hi everybody. Today we'll move our narrative forward through the 18th century and talk about two events in particular that scholars point to as precursors of the American Revolution. What we know is the First Great Awakening of the late 1730s and early 1740s, and the French and Indian War in North America fought between 1754 and 1763. Here we have a map of the English colonies around 1740. What happened over the early decades of the 18th century, in a nutshell, is that the colonies matured, grew older, more populated, developed, and more interconnected to each other. In the regions of the Chesapeake and New England, genocidal wars of extermination had removed Indians as any kind of threat to colonial interests. Slavery as an institution continued to grow in all the colonies, despite the scares of the Stono Rebellion in South Carolina in 1739 and the New York Slave Conspiracy of 1741. As the colonies themselves grew older and more developed, so too did their economies. In the Chesapeake, as we see indicated in this sketch, it was tobacco that made both Virginia planters and the British Crown extremely rich. In South Carolina, it was rice, and just like tobacco, as we see in this illustration, it was the product almost exclusively of slave labor. In the middle colonies in New England, although slavery existed as an institution, it was not the central feature around which the economy was organized. It was mostly free labor that, as we see indicated in these couple of sketches, produced the lumber and wheat being exported from places like Pennsylvania, New York, and Massachusetts. The English colonies in North America really occupied the best of both worlds in this era. The colonies and the mother country were locked together in an economic relationship that benefited and worked to the advantage of each. The colonies produced things that England could not. Tobacco and rice, the products of slave labor, made the Crown extremely wealthy. Further, the profits the colonies generated through their exports allowed them to purchase from the mother country those things that they could not make themselves, namely all variety of manufactured goods, from cloth to cooking ware. Here we have a map that indicates the different products and people that were moving throughout the British Empire in the 18th century. England and its North American colonies were both making plenty of money, and everyone was happy. There was probably no time when the colonists felt prouder to be a part of the British Empire. One of the byproducts of this close economic relationship between the mother country and its colonies is that they became more market-driven, swept up in the forces of early global capitalism and the demand of world markets. Inevitably, as in any capitalist system, some did better than others in the competition to get ahead economically. Still more, no matter how hard they worked, remained stuck in place, not falling too far behind, but never seeming to move forward either. The majority, unable to adjust to changing times and the faster pace of life, or simply unlucky, did fall behind, sometimes losing everything. This maturing, competitive marketplace created a stressful and anxiety-ridden existence for many colonists, one that not a few religious leaders began to take notice of by the 1730s, especially in New England. Protestant ministers started to criticize what they described as a turning away from religion in the life of the colonies. In the drive for economic success and the stresses that came along with it, colonists were losing any sense of spiritual purpose in their lives. The idea of the colonies as a shining example of Protestant perfection that the old world could follow as a city upon a hill was clearly in danger of disappearing. The question facing religious leaders was what to do about it. Protestant Christian thought had moved forward somewhat by the early decades of the 18th century. Puritans no longer referred to themselves as such. They were now Congregationalists. Protestant theologians of the period divided into two camps: evangelicals and rationalists. Although they were beginning to hedge a bit on the issue by now, evangelicals still largely believed in Calvinist predestination, and they preached that God took an active interest and an active hand in the affairs of human beings. Christian rationalist thinkers no longer believed in predestination, teaching instead that God wanted all to be saved, and that if the faithful lived good lives of generosity and charity and atoned for their sins, they would be saved in the afterlife. Rationalists also challenged the idea that God continued to take an active hand in the affairs of human existence. They suggested that after creating the universe and everything in it, God was a hands-off deity who set up a series of laws by which everything could operate, what we might call the laws of nature or of physics, then left humans to their own devices to determine their own eternal destinies. The Congregationalist minister, Jonathan Edwards, who we see here in this image, was an evangelical preacher at Northampton, Massachusetts. As he told the story, one day, while delivering a sermon to his congregants, a number of women suddenly fell out into the aisles of his church and began gyrating around on the floor. Others burst into tears, and many cried out with great emotion. By their own account, he reported, they'd been taken over by the Spirit of God. Edwards, who we see again here in a couple of artistic interpretations of him ministering to his parishioners, became more certain that God was behind what he was witnessing when it continued to happen over and over, virtually every time he preached. He decided to tell the world about the miraculous occurrences in Northampton, what Edwards called a great work of God. His written account, which we have the cover of here, was published in 1737 under the title A Faithful Narrative in both London and in the colonies. It drew immediate interest from Protestant ministers almost everywhere. Before long, others started to report similar events within their own congregations, and a revival was born. Like Edwards, Protestant ministers testified to what they saw as nothing less than the hand of God intervening in the affairs of humankind, to pull them back from the blind pursuit of mammon toward the true purpose of human existence, the quest for salvation in the afterlife. Some ministers of what came to be known as the First Great Awakening, like Edwards, employed a fire and brimstone style of preaching, effectively terrifying their parishioners into repentance from sin and toward more godly, moral lives. One of Edwards' most famous sermons, which we have the cover of here, Sinners, in the Hands of an Angry God was first printed in 1741. In it, Edwards literally threatens his listeners and readers with the fiery pit and everlasting hellfire, seemingly every other line. Just a couple of samples of his messaging makes the point. As he stated, "The God that holds you over the pit of hell, much as one holds a spider, abhors you and is dreadfully provoked." Or in another saying, again in his words, "Almost every natural man that hears of hell flatters himself that he shall escape it." No wonder people reacted emotionally to this kind of preaching. It was designed to stoke extreme feelings of fear, remorse, repentance, and hopefully, from ministers like Edwards' perspective, a renewed dependence upon and devotion to God, out of sheer terror, if nothing else. There was also another style of preaching during the revivals of the First Great Awakening, one that had an even greater impact in drawing people closer to or back to God. In England, in the months following the publication of Edwards' faithful narrative, a Protestant minister emerged whose name would become synonymous with the revivals of the period: George Whitefield, who we have here in this image. Where Edwards preached fire and brimstone, Whitefield preached love, specifically God's unconditional love for humanity, and in turn, humankind's need to reciprocate, to love God first, above all else. One of Whitefield's favorite stories to tell from the Bible was that of Abraham's willingness to give up his only son, Isaac, to God as a sacrifice. God, convinced of Abraham's fealty, allows Isaac to live, and a covenant between God and the house of Abraham is begun. Part of what made Whitefield so effective and so popular, he became a veritable celebrity in England and the colonies, was not just the unique message he preached in comparison to his contemporaries, but his unusual combination of personal qualities. He was a short man and pudgy. He was also, as we can get an idea from this illustration, cockeyed, which created an odd effect upon people who watched him preach, in that they could not exactly tell if he was looking at them, even when he was looking at them. He added to this physical appearance, by all accounts, an incredibly powerful voice, meaning he could project it across great distances in a time before microphones or speakers. It was also apparently a beautiful sounding voice, despite the volume, that fell like music on the ears of his listeners. People who witnessed a George Whitefield sermon in person tended to remember and write about it for the rest of their lives. In 1739, he created great excitement by announcing that he was coming to America to visit and tour the colonies. From Maine to Georgia, over a period of 2 years, Whitefield preached his unique message of love to the colonists, one that he claimed would lead them to something all believers had to have before they could become true Christians, what he described as a new birth experience. Whitefield himself claimed to have undergone the epiphany-like rite of passage. It could happen through prayer, while intently listening to a sermon, even while simply walking and pondering the beauty of nature. But when it happened, every believer would know it. The new birth, as Whitefield characterized it, was essentially an epiphany, a moment when all of a sudden the overwhelming power of God's love courses through the subject like the flow of a mighty river, drowning out all anxiety over one's eternal fate, and allowing the believer to rest comfortably in the knowledge that whatever the future holds, it rests in the hands of a loving God. This was not a guarantee of salvation. God alone still decided. But what the new birth did was permit Protestant Christians to live free of the kind of anxiety that paralyzed one's ability to function in the everyday affairs of life. Whitfield's new birth doctrine put him at odds with religious leaders in the colonies of the Christian rationalist persuasion, who insisted that God wanted all to reach salvation and guaranteed it as a reward for lives of morality, prayer, generosity, and charity. Their opposition did nothing to stop Whitfield from taking his message wherever he pleased, and he was aided in his efforts by none other than Benjamin Franklin. The founding father from Philadelphia was himself a rationalist, but he became a Whitfield convert of a sort after going to hear him preach when he visited Franklin City. Here we have a couple of illustrations depicting Whitfield's preaching during his time at Philadelphia. When Franklin went to hear him, as the story is told, he had pockets full of copper, silver, and gold coins. Typically, when Whitfield spoke, a hat was passed around to accept donations, at least a few times during his sermon. The money went toward financing Whitfield's further travels to other colonies to continue his ministry. Franklin, being a rationalist and a skeptic, was determined that Whitfield should have none of his money. But when the beautiful sound of the English minister's voice reached his ears, Franklin fell under the spell everyone else who heard him described. And before he left the service, our founding father reports, he'd emptied his pockets not just of his copper and silver pieces, but even all his gold. Franklin did not become an evangelical, but he did see in Whitfield's charismatic power and celebrity status a chance to sell newspapers, namely copies of his publication, the Pennsylvania Gazette. Franklin became Whitfield's chief publicist for the remainder of his stay in the colonies, advertising him well in advance of every new location and making plenty of profit along the way. The new birth doctrine he preached did not get Whitfield into any real trouble until he started telling the people who came to hear him that it was perfectly all right if, after returning to their regular congregations, they asked their own ministers whether they had undergone the new birth experience. If their ministers had not, or if they rejected the doctrine, Whitfield suggested it was fine for parishioners to start forming their own new congregations and to reject the authority of their regular, official religious leaders. Rationalists rejected the doctrine outright, but there were plenty of evangelicals who did so as well. As Whitfield and other ministers spread the revivals across the colonies, those who opposed or remained skeptical of the new birth doctrine came to be known by a moniker, Old Lights, and those who supported and helped advance the idea became known as, not surprisingly, New Lights. Many of the New Light preachers were what we call lay preachers, individuals never trained at divinity schools or with any real religious expertise, other than the fact that they claimed to have experienced the new birth Whitfield described. They'd been moved by the Spirit, and now were looking to lead their own flocks, to spread the word. Old Light ministers were horrified at the shattering and splintering of congregations and established churches. They saw Whitfield's new birth doctrine, and especially the advent of lay preaching, as nothing more than a breakdown of religious and social order in the colonies. From their perspective, what was happening in the revivals was not a so-called work of God, but instead an operation run by slick promoters that was leading the colonies into a state of religious and social anarchy. Over time, even Whitefield became concerned at the spreading phenomenon of lay preaching, and he tried to clarify his point, saying he did not mean that just anyone could start a ministry. New lights who tried to put the brakes on to dial back the splintering of Protestant churches, but who still believed in the doctrine of the new birth, came to be known as moderates. Radicals were ministers who insisted on pushing the revivals still further. One of the byproducts of the First Great Awakening, beyond the spread of lay preaching and the splintering of older, traditional congregations, was the growth of Baptist and Methodist denominations. Although both strains of Protestantism had been around for a while, their numbers started to explode in the middle decades of the 18th century. Unlike the Congregationalist and even Anglican churches, which generally required a divinity school education to become an ordained minister, the Methodists made this less of a priority, and the Baptists not at all. So as the number of lay preachers grew, most founded new Methodist, and especially Baptist, congregations. By the 19th century, they would surpass the older established Congregational and Anglican churches many times over in terms of their size and numbers of followers. Another dynamic of the First Great Awakening, much commented upon by contemporaries, was the public presence of women and slaves at the revivals. For white women, the revivals presented an opportunity, not just to participate directly and exert influence over their religious lives. They also placed women in a public venue that brought them out of the home and into the realm of social and political affairs. For slaves, the revivals, with their intense physical and emotional displays, resembled in spirit, if not in content, African religious practices. So for the first time, significant numbers of enslaved people in the colonies started to take an interest in the Christian faith. So why do historians point to the First Great Awakening as a precursor to the American Revolution? The answer lies in the legacies of anti-authoritarianism, individualism, and spiritual diversity the revivals gave rise to. The old lights called it a breakdown of religious and social order, but the awakening also taught colonists that they could successfully challenge established authorities when they joined together in a broad popular movement, in this case against religious authority. But what if they wanted to challenge entrenched political power, for example, the Crown of England? The First Great Awakening suggested that such a movement might be possible. The idea that individuals could take charge of their religious destinies, form their own churches, become lay preachers themselves, and the idea that they had a right to do these things could easily, under the right circumstances, translate into the idea of individual rights that protected people not just from religious, but also from political tyranny. And finally, the splintering of American Protestantism and growing acceptance of lay preaching hinted at a respect for religious freedom, religious expression, that would become a hallmark of American life in the future United States. From the perspective of Indian peoples in North America, if a great war ever broke out between England and France for control of the continent, it was not a difficult decision for most tribes to determine and make up their minds about which side they would fight on. The French by far represented less of a threat to Indians. Although they claimed more land than the British, they were largely just that, claims. The fact was that in comparison to the densely populated British colonies, there simply were not that many French people in North America. The French were mostly interested in trade with Indian peoples, rather than conquest and colonies. Because of this, when the conflict came in the mid-1750s, most Indians sided with France. The French and Indian War, as it came to be known, was fought in the colonies between 1754 and 1763. It was part of a larger global conflict between European powers, including the Dutch and Spanish, for colonial possessions overseas, that in Europe was known as the 7 Years' War. In North America, the region initially in dispute was the Ohio Valley, which both England and France wanted to possess at the other's expense, as it was the gateway to trade with the Great Lakes, and also represented, from the British perspective, prime real estate to expand settlements into. In 1754, as we see in this sketch, a young George Washington was sent into the valley to try and expel the French. Only 20-something at the time, Washington found himself the victim of Indian intrigues and was lucky to escape what became known as the Battle of Fort Necessity with his life. Here on this map we can find Fort Necessity near the bottom left. It also shows the major movements and battles between the sides throughout all the years of the conflict. Engagements that occurred from the Ohio Valley all the way north to Montreal, Quebec, and beyond. The English government responded to Washington's failed mission in 1755 by sending over a professional soldier, General William Braddock, with over 2,000 troops, and orders to accomplish what Washington could not, pushing the French out of the Ohio Valley region. Washington idolized Braddock, a veteran of European wars, and the epitome of martial leadership and glory, as far as the young founding father was concerned. But Braddock was also a stubborn, conceited traditionalist when it came to military strategy, and as a result he found himself in trouble right from the start of his campaign. Braddock had brought with him not only 2,100 soldiers, but also draft animals, cannons, and carriages full of supplies. He expected to move all of this to his target, Fort Duquesne in the Ohio Valley, occupied by his French enemy. Of course, there were no paved roads in 1755 for him to travel upon. Braddock's men would have to literally cut and hack their way, the whole way, to the French-occupied garrison. It would not exactly be a covert venture. Washington tried to warn Braddock that this may not be the best approach, and he spoke from experience. He tried to convince the general to recruit at least some Indian allies, but Braddock would hear none of it. He was convinced that Indians could never stand up to trained British regulars in the field. He would march straight toward the French and Indian forces at Fort Duquesne and crush them. It took more than a month for Braddock to get there, and when he did, the French and their Indian allies sprang their trap, an ambush that wiped out half of Braddock's army, including the general himself, who was fatally wounded, a moment captured in this famous painting. What Braddock had failed to recognize or at least acknowledge, was that the French in North America did not always fight like they did back in Europe. In the colonies of New France, they'd adapted to Indian-style guerrilla warfare, hit-and-run tactics, and were always looking to capture the element of surprise, rather than marching headlong into pitched battles with standing armies. In the early years of the contest for North America, one French general, who we have here in this painting, Pierre de Rigaud, Marquis de Vaudreuil-Cavagnal, what a name, right? He gave the British fits with his unorthodox approach to fighting the war. English fortunes did not start to turn around until a new prime minister came to power in 1757, captured in this portrait painting, William Pitt. Pitt was determined to vanquish the French from North America at all costs, even if it bankrupted the British Empire. He sent thousands of new troops to the colonies, along with a new general, James Wolfe, who proved to be far more competent than Braddock when it came to adapting to circumstances on the ground. Wolfe had distinguished himself at the Battle of Louisbourg, a British victory against the French in 1758. His impressive performance convinced Pitt to give him command of an expedition to assault and take the French fortress at Quebec. Learning from Braddock's mistakes, Wolfe quickly moved to secure Indian allies for his venture. He found them in the Mohawk of the Five Nations Iroquois. At the same time, and unfortunately for the French, General Vaudreuil was not in command at Quebec. Another general, Louis-Joseph de Montcalm, who we have here, was charged with the garrison's defense. The problem with General Montcalm was that he was much like a French version of General Braddock, a traditionalist who largely eschewed the tactics of the Indians in battle. He was also overly aggressive and confident. Despite heavily outnumbering the British forces under Wolfe, who came to attack him at Quebec, Montcalm launched his forces headlong into Wolfe's defensive positions, with results no better than Braddock at Fort Duquesne 4 years earlier. Montcalm was killed in the fighting, and so was General Wolfe on the British side, an event captured in this painting. But the French lost Quebec, and with it any real hope of holding out and winning the war. By 1760, the French had also surrendered Montreal. The formal Treaty of Paris that ended the French and Indian War on England's terms was signed in 1763. The map here shows what the French were forced to give up. Effectively, all their possessions in North America. The dark green area, still titled New France, is misleading. It was land claimed by France, but largely unpopulated by anyone other than the natives who had always lived there, and a few French traders. The French were finished in North America as any kind of a threat to British interests after around 1760. The Indians, on the other hand, were another story. The French may have been defeated, but the Indians had not. In 1763, the Cherokee Indians launched a series of devastating assaults that were ultimately beaten back in the Carolinas. That same year, an even more deadly and successful uprising in the Ohio Valley, known afterwards as Pontiac's Rebellion, temporarily threatened the British with losing control of the region they'd fought nearly a decade to secure. The Ottawa Indian chief Pontiac, along with the leaders of other tribes like the Shawnees, led a series of attacks that momentarily expelled the British from their fortifications throughout the valley, indicated here on this map. And in this illustration, give you another look at the map real quick. There were attacks all throughout the valley. Then the illustration of Pontiac's rebellion. The British may have held off Pontiac and his revolt, but the Indian resistance highlighted a bigger problem for the English government and the Pitt administration. The English no longer wanted to be fighting with Indians. It was too expensive a venture, and one they could not maintain indefinitely. Some resolution had to be found that would not only bring peace with the Indians, but that would also open back up trade with the tribes of the Valley region. After the 7 Years' War and French and Indian War, of which it was a part, were over, the British found themselves in possession of a global empire that stretched from Asia to Africa to the New World of the Americas. But the government was also nearly broke, facing an empty treasury. Money was what was needed, revenues on a scale capable of managing a worldwide empire. When William Pitt said he would defeat the French, even if it bankrupted the nation, he not only meant it, he nearly had to make good on his word. The contest for North America was won, but at an enormous cost. Proceeds from the fur trade were critical, and if that meant finding a way to pacify rather than fight the Indians, by 1763 the British were willing to entertain the idea. The solution they settled upon is indicated in our final image, which shows what became known as the Proclamation Line of 1763. Notice the shape of the red line. It neatly closes in the outline of the original 13 colonies that before long would make up the United States. What the Proclamation Line of 1763, adopted by Parliament, stated is that no colonial settlement was to be permitted anywhere to the west of the line, effectively anywhere west of the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River. The American colonists were stunned by the new policy. From their perspective, it was a good thing to be rid of the French, but what they had primarily been fighting for was access to land, the very real estate the British government was now telling them was off limits. They were outraged, especially as there was hardly a colonial family who had not lost someone in the bitter and bloody, nearly decade-long conflict. If they could not gain access to the lands they'd struggled so long to possess, then the war had been fought in vain. Before the disagreements over taxes and the legitimate powers of Parliament erupted, the disillusion over the adoption of the Proclamation Line stood as the original grievance of the colonists that led directly to the American Revolution. All right, so that does it for the First Great Awakening and the French and Indian War. Next time we'll look at the Revolution and what scholars call the imperial crisis of the 1760s that led up to it.